Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Our first session is entitled Building Partnerships and Restoring Public Lands. We have Dr. Michael Stevens. He's a professor of biology and the director of the Capitol Reef Field Station here at UVU, and Dr. Joshua Lenart, who's an associate instructor in the CLEAR program at the College of Engineering at Utah, the University of Utah. Today we're talking about interdisciplinary collaborative projects that focus on the restoration of public lands. Dr. Stevens will be outlining work that he's done as the director of the Capitol Reef Field Station, collaborating with the park and other stakeholders in restoration projects. He's also a public land enthusiast. You can find him out there biking, skiing, hiking, just really enjoying public land. So he is working out there and also playing out there. Dr. Lenart will be outlining public land restoration work based on different stakeholders' epistemological and ontological conceptions of nature. He's also out there recreating a lot, hunting and fishing, and he's worn a lot of hats. He's the past chair and the current policy advisor for the Utah chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Both of these presentations are going to outline the challenges and benefits of multiple stakeholders in the context of public lands with preservation and conservation mandates. I really enjoy hanging out and talking to both of these folks individually, and so I'm really excited about what this panel will be like together. And with no more ado, we will have Dr. Michael Stevens come and talk to you about his collaborative efforts.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks so much for the invitation and opportunity to speak here. And as Dr. Blevins mentioned, I'll be talking about our partnership between UVU and Capitol Reef National Park, and then how that partnership has led to some restoration on public lands. This was advancing just a second ago.
See if on the side it's turned on. The side of the clicker.
No. Weird. Okay, let me just try it on the screen. There we go. I'll just do it the old-fashioned way, I guess. So as I mentioned, we have a partnership between the National Park and UVU centered on the field station, Capitol Reef Field Station. And our partnership is really uncommon. There are only 11 university-operated field stations located in U.S. national parks. And our goal is for the educational experiences that occur at the field station to be remarkable as the landscape in which they occur. And we really do have an enviable setting at the mesa top in the center of the photo there. So here are the 11 university-operated field stations. You can see the majority of them are in California, but then they're throughout the United States and the U.S. Virgin Islands in places like Channel Islands, Grand Teton, Yosemite, and the Santa Monica National Recreation Area. And from this graph, you can see that the number of these University National Park field stations has nearly quadrupled since 2000. Before that, there were very few of these partnerships, but recently there have been many more. Our field station opened within that period of 2000. Our field station opened in 2008 within that period. So what is responsible for this increase? There are several possible reasons for this. When universities and national parks were better funded, perhaps they could open field stations on their own. But now with fiscal constraints, a lot of times those partnerships enable a field station to open and get off the ground. A lot of people are interested in tapping into the synergistic nature of partnerships in general. And then, of course, universities are looking for unique and collaborative ways to engage their students in the natural world. And then from the national park perspective, the parks are really interested in connecting with a younger and more diverse audience. So bringing university students to the national park is a great benefit to the National Park Service. So restoration, research, and monitoring are all synergistic ways to engage a variety of visitors with public lands. So today I'll be talking about some of the projects that have come from our partnership with the National Park. So some of the restoration efforts include graffiti removal, BioBlitz, which I'll talk about in more detail, and then invasive plant removal, research, and monitoring. So to help restore public lands, visitors to the field station often participate in service projects, and one of those service projects is graffiti removal. This shows Joe Cheradini, our former site manager, training university students in the process of removing graffiti from petroglyph panels to restore them to their previous condition. In 2019, we organized a BioBlitz, and if you're unfamiliar with that term, it's a concentrated effort where participants find, photograph, and identify as many species as possible within a set window of time. So this project involved citizen scientists, biologists and ecologists from the National Park Service, and then biologists and ecologists from UVU and other universities as well. So this shows us organizing for that event, and we divided into groups to characterize different areas of the park and look for diversity in a wide variety of areas. So the next couple slides just show some of our efforts looking at stream macroinvertebrates in some detail. We focused on plants and reptiles and insects. People went to extreme environments, ephemeral potholes, looking for those perhaps undescribed organisms. We stayed up late and did black lighting to look for moths and other insects that are attracted to a bright light. And then on the right, you can see our team of identifiers, because it's easy to take a photograph and a little bit more challenging to identify the species in the photograph. So this slide shows our herbarium curator, Erin Riggs, and her team of students who helped to identify those organisms that people found. We really got a lot of positive feedback from the National Park Service for our efforts. So this quotation is from the regional office in Fort Collins, Colorado. So I'm just going to take the time to read this. I took a second look at Capitol Reef iNaturalist observations this week, and I couldn't be more impressed. Through your efforts at the BioBlitz, the park has increased the iNaturalist observation count from about 700 observations at the beginning of the year to almost 4,000, an almost six-fold improvement. I hope it's been rewarding to engage both students and the public while collecting important information on park resources. It's also exciting to see that the park has received continued engagement since the event's end, as both more observations from the event have trickled in and additional visitors have contributed their own observations. And then I learned how to use iNaturalist for this event, and then I've just kept adding species as I've gone along. I'm almost up to 500 observations now. Also to help restore public lands, visitors often volunteer to remove invasive plants around the park and around the field station campus itself. And additionally, we have a botany major. His name is Josh Leone, who's doing research on an invasive plant, the African mustard. So he's studying its extent and then how to control it within the national park. So I want to talk a little bit about my plant ecology class. So each year I take my students to Capitol Reef Field Station, and as I mentioned, it's located on a mesa top right above Pleasant Creek, one of the 4 perennial streams that flow through the desert in Capitol Reef, making it a really unique environment. So one thing that we've offered the park is to monitor for invasive plants along this stream side or riparian corridor. And so this kind of shows our effort. So each year The students walk down, it's about 3/4 of a mile from the station to Pleasant Creek, and then we lay down a transect tape along the river, so you can see that the white line is our transect tape. And then you can also see the effects of flash floods, all of the debris wrapped around the cottonwood trees, and then the erosion right next to the stream. So this is a dynamic environment that changes from year to year, and then we seek to characterize the plant communities that are growing in that particular area. So just to kind of orient you with some of the data that we're collecting, so at the top you can see our transect line. So we have a 250-meter tape that we lay down along the streamside corridor. And then we're sampling in quadrats, which are reading frames. Our reading frames are 5 meters by 5 meters. And what we're looking for is the frequency, density, dominance, and importance of those particular plant species. So frequency is in how many quadrats does each species occur. So you can see in this example that the green species represented with those little POW symbols, it's found in 1 out of the 4 quadrats, whereas the blue species is found in 2 out of 4 quadrats, and the orange star species is located in 4 out of 4. So that's frequency. Density, we take into account how many individuals of each species there are. So there are 10 individuals shown in all those symbols. 3 of them are green, 2 of them are blue, and then 5 of them are orange. So that's density. And then dominance, we take into account how large the species are. And so we measure diameter at breast height. That's a standard metric that foresters use. So in the photo on the left, you can see a student, Allison Martin, measuring the diameter around that tree. So she's physically putting the tape around the circumference, but the tape is set to diameter. So you can directly measure that. And then importance is a composite metric where you just add frequency, density, and dominance together. So these are ways of quantifying what's going on in the community. So one thing that we found over time, we have several years of data, 7 years of data, and one concern of ours is that the native Fremont cottonwood is trending down. So if you look at the top line, that's the importance value. Remember, that's the composite metrics. So there's variation from year to year, but then there's a downward trend. So we're able to share these data with the park and then help to inform their management decisions. And they have biologists and ecologists who can do this, but what the university brings to the table is we've got 20 university students who are interested in plant ecology who can take all this data in an afternoon rather than having to take a month to gather these data. And then the invasive tamarisk is trending up. So you can see that its importance value varies from year to year, but from 2015 to 2022, these are data are hot off the press. We just got back from our trip last month. So tamarisk is trending up. And then when I put those data just for importance together, you can see that the community is still characterized by Fremont cottonwood. They're frequent, they show up in a lot of quadrats, they're dense, there are many of them, and then they're dominant. A Fremont cottonwood is much bigger than a tamarisk. So the community is still characterized by the native Fremont cottonwood, but then these data we can share with the park to show that the native species is trending down, whereas the tamarisk kind of lurking down there at the bottom, but still an upward trend that could cause some concern, and then may bring about some management practices to this particular area. And so in summary, I just want to highlight that the partnership between Capitol Reef Field Station, UVU, and Capitol Reef National Park has helped restore public lands through graffiti removal, our BioBlitz, and then invasive species research and monitoring. And there's my contact information, and then our web address for the field station is uvu.edu/CRFS if you're interested in finding out more or making a reservation to bring your class to the field station. So thanks so much for your time and attention.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Thomas, Dr. Blevins, for having me. I think our panels work really well together. I'll also be describing a collaborative student project on restoring public lands. It'll take me a minute to get there, but I think the topic of this symposium is very relevant and timely. Western public lands, I think there's fewer contentious issues that are unique to this region than the public land issue, especially given the fact that it's such a sensitive ecosystem. The sagebrush steppe occupies 15% of its native habitat, and so I think it is a very relevant, timely topic. So to begin, first off, I'm going to talk a little bit about a historical overview of public land management in the U.S. We'll talk about a theory for understanding revolution, sort of some theoretical underpinnings for how we've gotten to where we are today. I'm going to look at a case study involving students in collaborative public land restoration work. And then I'll give you 3 strategies for enhancing sustainability and greater social and environmental justice on public lands writ large. So why is it so challenging? We look at a degraded stream and then the recovery of that. We look at a reseeded forest fire and we think, this is great. Why is this so hard? In order to ask that question, I think it's important that you first understand that people have many, many different conceptions of nature itself, right? And so if you think about how people intuit or know nature, how they engage with it, it varies from person to person along a continuum. And so if you look at this overview, you have something like a biologist who maybe approaches nature as an object, traditional science. Juxtaposed to that is something like deep ecology, right? This idea of like animism, coming back in another life as an owl, things like that. And I don't mean to say that pejoratively, but they occupy 2 very different spaces. And so if you look, as you come closer to the center, in this case, treating nature as a resource, business, industry, agriculture have a lot of similarities and overlaps between them. And so you have all these different conceptions of the way people know or understand nature. Similarly, the way people talk about nature is very different. So an ethnocentric view might look at something like regulatory control, right? How many fish can you take from a stream? How many bikers can you have on a mountain bike? What days can you walk on a trail with a dog? Those kind of things. Versus something like maybe a poetic discourse, right? Waxing rhapsodic about nature, right? So the way people understand nature and the way people talk about it's very different. And that presents a real challenge when you're trying to identify stakeholder needs, what's best for the landscape, for the wildlife, for the resources. And so combining these can be a really tricky challenge a lot of times. So I want to give a brief history. I'm an avid hunter, as Maria mentioned. And hunter conservationists have had a lengthy history within conservation restoration movement on public lands. So if you're not familiar, the story begins around the mid 19th century. It's an era that was classified as one of the largest exploitations of wildlife ever. Some 65 million buffalo once roamed the Great Plains. And these images you see, these are all buffalo skulls waiting to be packed on a railroad car to be sent to a fertilizer plant. They would be ground down and used as fertilizers and or put into sugar. It was an additive to sugar to make sugar last longer. hunters, along with a lot of other organizations and efforts, have largely recovered the species. At one point, there was a small band of buffalo in Yellowstone National Park. Some estimate between 45 and 60 buffalo. There were bands in Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So we went from 65 million buffalo to around 450 total species in the North America. And now we have a lot of free-ranging herds. We have 19 herds, 11,000 buffalo. There's 3 public land buffalo hunts held in the state. And that's a really significant fact, the fact that in this modern era, we can still have free-ranging buffalo in a sustainable population that can be called and harvested by public land hunters. So I don't know how much of this backstory you're familiar with, but in response to this huge exploitation in the 19th century of wildlife writ large, you have President Theodore Roosevelt who comes along around this time and sees the need to conserve both public land resources and the wildlife. One of his early advocates in office was John Muir. If you're familiar, John Muir had a very passionate attitude and posture towards public lands. He was instrumental in helping Yosemite and things like those areas in California become protected. Later in Theodore Roosevelt's tenure in office, another one of his trust advisors was Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was one of the first, was the first ranger of the U.S. Forest Service, and Gifford and Muir had very different ideas of how nature should be treated. Muir wanted to protect and conserve it. Gifford wanted to maximize profit and sustain yield in terms of the forest surplus. Along comes Otto Leopold a number of years later, who really revitalized a hunter conservation land ethic. Leopold's contribution largely was to take man as not dominant from nature, but to become an interspliced part of nature. So to move from dominance to an integral part of a biotic community, and that's important. Unless you think it was all crusty white dudes who served this movement, Francis Hammerstrom was Otto Leopold's first and only graduate student, oftentimes given credit for recovering the greater prairie chicken. Celia Hunter was a World War II pilot who went on to help save or protect and conserve the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, passed legislation in the 1980s to protect some 100 million acres of public land in Alaska. And Marie Tharp, interestingly enough, wrote the first, or drew cartographically the first underwater image of the ocean, discovered continental drift before it was obviously filmed and recorded later by Jacques Cousteau. Interestingly enough, had never been on a ship because in that era, it was unlucky to have a woman on board. And so you can still find Marie Tharp's historical layer in Google Earth as one of the layers that you can look at. So there's been a lengthy history here that's kind of led up to this present time. All right, so if you're interested in reading some more on these texts, these are 4 texts that I've drawn heavily from, just in my own life and reading. UVU's own Chip Ward, if you haven't read this one, Canaries on the Rim, is a really great piece about how citizen science works in the Grantsville-Tooele area. It's a great text. Some more background. So the approach I take, you can draw from different venues of the humanities in order to get to sort of some of this research. But the route I took, ultimately, we kind of coined this phrase, eco-critical discourse analysis. And I'm gonna explain here how that works in a way that might make more sense of why working with some of these public land agencies can be so challenging. So you look at something like the U.S. Forest Service. If you look at their mission statement, and I'm going to read this so you can kind of hear how it sounds, but I want you to keep in mind as I go through this, the mission statements of these agencies really direct the focus and the goal of the agency. And so you'll hear quite a bit of difference in these next couple slides. So for the U.S. Forest Service, the mission of the USDA Forest Service is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of the present and future generations. So you see these words that are trending towards a conservative ecological vein, sustain the health and diversity, versus a more developer, sort of resource-driven word like productivity. Meet the needs is somewhat ambiguous, right? Because the needs for a farmer or a miner is different than the needs, say, for a mountain biker or a fisherman, right? And so I kind of left that one in the middle. Look at something like the Bureau of Land Management. Their multiple use and sustain yield mandate to manage public lands for a variety of uses, such as energy development, livestock grazing, recreation, timber harvesting, while ensuring the natural, cultural, and historical resources are maintained for present and future use. So here you see some of that conservation ecological language fall out, and you see much more emphasis placed on development, grazing, harvesting, etc. Look at Utah's own school institutional trust lands. SITLA manages 3.4 million acres in the state of Utah. Unlike public lands, trust lands are not held in public trust. Rather, they are held in trust for 12 beneficiaries defined and designated by Congress at statehood. SITLA works with private businesses to generate revenue from energy and mineral royalties and real estate and surface development. And so here you see even more the pendulum swing towards an economic viewpoint as opposed to an ecological viewpoint of how these lands are treated and managed, and ultimately, when given the need, restored. So this map, if you zoom in on this key, you can really see the priorities of SITLA lands in the key here where it talks about mineral rights, oil and gas fields, etc. All right, so that's kind of an overview for how we got to today. So what I do, I teach engineering communication. Mostly I work with civil and environmental engineering students. And we organize our class around a single semester-long project in which we partner with state, federal agencies, other non-NGOs, to try to pick a project to restore public lands. And so in this particular project, we were looking at a restoration effort up North Willow Creek. It's in the Stansbury Range, just west of Grantsville, Tooele area, if you're familiar with it. In this project, we had four partners actually: the U.S. Forest Service, the Division of Wildlife Resources, and other NGOs. And we had 4 goals. We wanted to increase the watershed health, close illegal routes. I'll talk about reintroducing native Bonneville cutthroat, and then identify funding sources to fund the project. So this is a picture of the current condition along North Willow Creek. You can see here it's a hard-packed campsite just immediately adjacent the creek itself. This is a riparian corridor. We live in the second driest state in the West. This should be thriving with grasses, native forbs, things like that, and instead it's just hard-packed, nothing can grow here. In the second image, these are images my students took from a site visit we had to North Willow Creek. Here you see the road itself crossing the creek. You see the obstruction to fish passage here, so fish can no longer travel up and down the creek because it's so severely degraded. So what we did, we looked at 4 alternatives: no action costing the least, creating a riparian buffer costing the most, and then varieties of scale along the lines. So the first team of students were tasked with identifying illegal routes. You can see here the work they've done. They took Google Earth. They used an ArcGIS program to overlay that on Google Earth. And what you see here are the start and the tailings off of the illegal routes. So you have the main road going up the canyon, and then the pin represents where somebody's taken an ATV or a mountain bike or a dirt bike and sort of just charted over the landscape willy-nilly wherever they want. And so the first goal, we wanted to work with the Uinta Wasatch Cache National Forest to identify and close these routes. And you kind of see here the level of problem it really is in this little drainage. So once they identified that, they were then able to model where an alternative road would be to get that road off of the canyon floor, up on, higher on the landscape. Another group looked at stream bank erosion. There's 3 wet crossings on this. And so they looked at a variety of alternatives of either developing a ford, a culvert, a bridge. And what that did is provide alternatives for crossing the creek without creating that erosion in the wet crossing. The third facet was really interesting. So North Willow Creek enters a pipe around this diversion structure, and it travels underground 3 miles to Grantsville Reservoir. We talked to the DWR, and they were interested in introducing native Bonneville cutthroat. Currently, non-native rainbow and brown occupy that creek. Well, if you're going to introduce a new species, first you have to rotenone the creek, which is rotenone, if you're familiar, is an organic chemical that's used to deoxygenate the water. It kills all aquatic life, and then you're able to bring in the native species. But you need to prevent them from going downstream, and so this group of students looked at a variety of structures to implement on this diversion structure so that the fish wouldn't be washed downstream. The last group was tasked with identifying funding sources, and really this is an important part of any project like this because stakeholder outreach and education was really important, so increasing signage, awareness, things like that. Ultimately, we compiled this report. It was about a 250-page report that the students produced. We submitted it to the Uinta-Wasatch National Forest, and that project was awarded $367,000 through the Watershed Restoration Initiative, which is a state-run project. It's hard funded through the through the state legislature, and so ultimately it was a real success for both the students, the Forest Service, and the creek itself. We use a triple bottom line approach. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this because I know I'm running low on time. I think I'll just skip ahead to sort of the takeaways from this. So I think it's really important, especially working with students, to recognize undergraduate education as a really profound tool for modeling and implementing these kinds of projects. Because I think it's important to remember, firstly, our relationship to nature is deeply rhetorical, right? If you think about something as simple as a meal, a food, where your food comes from, it's helpful in identity construction, whether you shop at Whole Foods or whether you shop at Walmart, socioeconomics, preparation ritual, whether you say a prayer before dinner, or whether you watch dinner in front of the TV. All of this helps us form our identity both within ourselves, but also how we relate to others. Secondly, how we talk about restoration matters. If you consider how agricultural language talks about hunting, something like being harvested, restricted. If you talk about how scientists treat the land, they talk about habitat and ecosystems. Politicians talk about landscapes or management units. But what's lost in that language is the land and the wilderness itself, the wildness. And I think people sometimes cloak language as a way to hide behind sometimes nefarious intents. And then lastly, restoration is a delicate balance between social, biological, economic, and ecological factors. I think the main takeaway is that oftentimes the way scientists and politicians use data to talk about land and wildlife does not necessarily correlate to how we understand and talk about it ourselves. And so I think it's important to invite people into the table and not use language to exclude them from that conversation. So that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I will we'll be around for questions.
Thank you very much. Well, I think you probably could both answer this, and yeah, thank you so much for these presentations. I think it was really very informative. But I think maybe Michael, because you mentioned, right, I think the graffiti removal, and it was just, I guess, kind of on the technical level. I think when I visited the Capitol Reef field station, I was kind of always struck, right, by this problem of the baseline of restoration, right? And I think, like, in terms of graffiti, I was wondering whether you have any more information on, I guess, when something becomes part of the historical record and thereby protected, as opposed to, like, something that actually defaces the historical record. So I kind of just was wondering whether you have any more information on that.
Yeah, it's actually very funny. Is this on? I thought it was on. Yeah, it's on. Okay. It's actually very funny that to me, because I recently turned 50, and that's the standard for being preserved. So my kids, when we go down there, they said, you know, Dad, we can just leave you in the desert now because you're over 50. So it is interesting to think that, you know, there's a First Peoples record on the rock, and then there's a pioneer record on the rock. But then 50 years is not very long. So, but it starts a very interesting conversation where the hike from the field station down to the petroglyph panel, and after a rainstorm you see more of these, but they're old tin cans and glass bottles that were from someone's dump, but it's from 50 years ago, so that's historic. And so things can be gleaned from that, and then there's some value. But then the challenge for me is that when those areas that were marked by First Peoples and then pioneers, there's a layering because people are attracted to those spots, and then a lot of times the more recent scrawls are detracting from the message and meaning of those places. So I think it's a pretty low bar, 50 years. Like, I made it. So. So. Mm-hmm.
Michael, what was the solution? Was it just a water bottle that they were using to remove the graffiti? Or was it some sort of like hydrogen peroxide or?
Yeah, it's pretty low tech because it's a light touch. So yeah, water and then a scrubbing brush.
Okay.
And then the message is to not scrub too hard. So that's the challenge.
Yeah.
Michael, I'd like to add on to this 50-year question because in the Southwest, yellowcake uranium is found in public lands and national parks and things like that. That's more than 50 years old. Where does the line get drawn between one and the other? And since I have the microphone, I was going to ask another question to Josh. You talk about the use of terms, and I noticed that you were very self-conscious in your use of the term harvest. With regard to hunter ethics, but that's also a term we use for agriculture as well. So where do we draw lines there, or are we very, very inclusive? And at what point does inclusiveness make it so that we water down meaning? And then maybe I'll ask you this, Michael, on top of that, where does harvest get used with the National Park Service with regard to animals and things like that? Would that same term be used? So I'm kind of curious to see you in a conversation about that also as well. So.
Yeah.
So sorry, lots of things, but
Sure. No, it's a great question. I think, for me at least, a lot of my talk was born out of a frustration with the Division of Wildlife, and not the Utah Division of Wildlife exactly, but with how wildlife biologists talked about managing wildlife. And I kind of had to get over that. I actually serve now on the Regional Advisory Council for the Division of Wildlife in the Central Region. And what I've learned is I don't think the language of a biologist is necessarily exclusionary on purpose. However, it's very, to somebody who's not familiar with how a biologist talks about wildlife, it seems very foreign, and it seems like almost a different language. And I always felt like that was used to keep people from engaging in the conversation. And I think I've amended that to sort of understand, once you're able to code switch in a way to be a part of that conversation, I think you're able to participate, but you have to have that introductory knowledge of the language, or else you're not given credence in that conversation. And so I think it's important to use a word like harvest, but at the end of the day, know that you mean taking or killing an animal, or taking and growing crops and, and harvesting them for food in that way. So I don't know if that gets to it, but.
Yeah, and then I would just respond that some of the terms that I introduced, the frequency, density, and dominance, I mean, those could be perhaps off-putting scientific words. But on the other hand, I mean, it's just another way of experiencing the landscape and describing it, because you can walk along the creek and say there are, tall trees that turn and their leaves turn yellow in the fall. But then if you're assessing that type of data, you're intentionally looking at, where is it growing? Is it in the quadrat or out? And then you're counting them, and it's like, how many of them are there? And then you're putting your hands around it, like, how big is it? So I think those are just additional ways to interact. And so you could say, yes, it's a tool of science, but it's just another way of looking at and describing that landscape. Oh, yeah. So a lot of times people describe national parks and even just public lands. They use the word pristine, which I find problematic because you mentioned uranium. Capitol Reef National Park has an old uranium mine. So, like, how pristine can that be? So I like to describe them more as natural areas, and they're certainly more natural, and they're managed in a different way than other places, and typically harvests aren't even allowed, whereas the National Forest that's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they're maximizing productivity of a resource, whereas the National Park Service, it's more about preserve and protect, and so I think they would say, do your harvest somewhere else. But yeah, I think those terms are important to kind of grapple with. So it's, better than a city, but like, is it pristine? And then, what brings us, what attracts us to those areas?
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to phrase this question, but I will say that photo of the Mountain of Skulls was shocking. It was, and just really indicative of this foundational, what it seems like in our particular culture is this unfettered level of consumption. Without restrictions, we consume and consume and consume. And so obviously we're in a situation where we've seen that horrifying picture, and that's not sustainable. And so in this, as we're having these conversations and looking at, this rhetoric of our relationship with nature and policy and what kind of language is acceptable in policy, at the root, the message that I feel we need to get across that is a challenge in our culture is to want less and to consume less, because and that's a challenge in our culture. So like, how in your work and your engagement with various stakeholders and policymakers, how can we find that connection between reconnecting with the land and how it feeds us, but also recognizing that there's this other side of us that really wants stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a really great question. It's important to note about that photo, it wasn't just about the market for oftentimes the hides and tongues. A lot of the meat was gone to waste, right? So there was a market for hides, there was a market for tongue, and the rest of the buffalo was laid to waste. A lot of that was about the removal of Native Americans from that landscape, because without the buffalo, the Native Americans didn't have a livelihood. Some estimates that the early Plains Indians killed around 250,000 buffalo a year, and that was a sustainable number at that time. Once Western expansion happened, in that rapid succession, they disappeared, and along with it, the Native people. And so there's two parts of that picture that I think are important. But your better question, I think, it's such a challenge because we live in this place that's amazing. It's experiencing huge growth. We've all heard the statistic that Salt Lake Valley is going to double in size by 2045 or 2050. And I look around and I think, why didn't I invest in a crane company 15 years ago? Because there's cranes everywhere. And now we know the aquifer is shrinking. We know there's less water in the Great Salt Lake. I think it's important to remind yourself in your own place, but if you're going to have any political engagement, whether that's with Forest Service or BLM planning meetings or management plans, whether you work with the D Division of Wildlife, whether you work with Heal Utah, I think you have to find your own place to contribute your efforts. Because if you try to take the whole issue of overconsumption, of climate change, you'll never be effective. But if you figure out one vein I think you can work in, I do believe that change happens there, but it's so small and incremental, it's going to happen gradually. But to do nothing seems like the worst and weakest posture. So I don't know that I have a great answer for you, but you've hit the nail on the head in terms of taking more than we necessarily ought or should, or is ultimately sustainable.
And one thing we do at the field station, when the visitors come to the field station, we actually measure and weigh their trash. And so we compare their consumption and trash production to a typical American, to their group. And then we have a leaderboard, so we really elevate the status of groups that produce less trash. We also keep track of their water, so they can think about consumption of a limited resource in a desert. And then our hope is that those practices of conservation and reduced consumption and reducing waste continue into their regular lives at home. So that's one thing. That's the power of education and connecting a new group of visitors with the National Park Service and public lands. I think that's one thing we can do to combat the desire to accumulate as many buffalo skulls as possible.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point. I'll just add one last thought to that. In our own projects, say for example the North Willow Creek example that I mentioned, I had a group of 24 students that semester, and engineering students tend to be from literally all over the world. I have a lot of students from Asia, from Europe, working with students in an engaged kind of way that Michael's doing at the field station, that I try to do with my students on the ground doing site visits. I was able to influence a group of students in a profound way, and I know because I've gotten feedback that never would have made sense in a classroom. So moving, I know my sphere of influence is limited to sort of Division of Wildlife, the university, but within that, I know you can make profound change and impact on people's lives, and I think that is an encouraging, hopeful place, as opposed to the opposite of just throwing up your arms and saying nothing can ever be done.
I want to thank all of you for taking part in this panel, and I want to thank Dr. Stevens, Dr. Lenart for your really intriguing talk. So please stick around. Our next panels are awesome, and we appreciate you being